Every day, Miguel Torres silently endured the cruel pranks and mockery from Westridge Academy's wealthiest students. His mop and bucket became weapons used against him by teenagers who saw his immigrant status and humble job as entertainment. The administration looked away, protecting their donors' children rather than their dedicated employee. But when an unexpected celebrity visitor witnesses their cruelty firsthand, the halls of privilege are about to get a lesson in humanity they never expected, courtesy of Keanu Reeves himself. Westridge Academy stood like a fortress on the outskirts of Los Angeles, its manicured lawns and Gothic architecture a daily reminder of the privilege housed within its walls. Tuition started at $50,000 a year, not including the suggested donations that parents understood were actually mandatory. The children of Hollywood executives, tech moguls, and old money families filled its classrooms. Many dropped off in vehicles worth more than what Mr. Torres earned in 5 years. Miguel Torres had worked at Westridge for almost 8 years now. He had come to America from El Salvador 25 years ago, working whatever jobs he could find to bring his family over one by one. Now, he sent money home each month to support his elderly mother and help pay for his granddaughter's college education. His own children had never had such opportunities, but his granddaughter Carmen was studying medicine at Cal State. The thought always brought a smile to his lined face, even on the worst days. And there were many bad days at Westridge. The worst offenders were a group of seniors who called themselves the Dynasty: Blake Harrington, whose father owned half the real estate in downtown L.A., Aiden Parker, son of a famous director, Madison Wright, heiress to a tech fortune, and Tyler Jenkins, whose mother was a state senator with presidential aspirations. They moved through the halls of Westridge like they owned them, which, in a way, they did. Their parents' donations had built the new science wing, funded the championship football team, and kept Principal Hargrove firmly in their corner. Lily Whitlock watched from her locker as Mr. Torres cleaned up yet another mess created by the Dynasty. Unlike most students at Westridge, Lily was there on scholarship. Her parents had immigrated from Taiwan and ran a small grocery store in Echo Park. She kept her head down, studied hard, and tried to remain invisible, especially to the Dynasty. She had witnessed their cruelty toward Mr. Torres escalate over the past few months, each prank more elaborate than the last, but she had never spoken up. The price of standing out at Westridge was too high. Principal Hargrove walked by, his tailored suit immaculate as always, phone pressed to his ear as he discussed fundraising strategy with a board member. He barely glanced at Mr. Torres, stepping around the wet floor without breaking stride. Mr. Torres was as invisible to the administration as he was visible to the bullies, acknowledged only when convenient, ignored when in need. "Hey, janitor! You missed a spot," Blake called out, deliberately dropping his half-empty smoothie on the clean section of floor. His friends laughed, high-fiving each other as Mr. Torres silently moved to clean the new mess. This was Westridge Academy, a place where money spoke louder than character, where status determined worth, and where a hard-working man could be reduced to a punchline simply because of the job he performed with quiet dignity day after day. The pranks had started small, a trash can accidentally knocked over as Mr. Torres cleaned, gum stuck under tables he had just wiped down, shoes deliberately wiped on freshly mopped floors. But over time, the Dynasty had grown bolder, their need for attention and validation from their peers pushing them toward increasingly cruel stunts. Last week, they had locked Mr. Torres in the supply closet for 2 hours, claiming it was an accident when he was finally discovered by a security guard. The week before, they had planted a stink bomb in the trash room where he ate his lunch alone each day. Yesterday, they had plastered the hallway with fake immigration alert posters featuring a poorly photoshopped image of his face. Each incident had been met with indifference from the administration. "Boys will be boys," Principal Hargrove had said dismissively when Mr. Torres had tentatively raised concerns about the closet incident. "I'm sure they didn't mean any harm." Mr. Torres had nodded and walked away, his shoulders slightly more stooped than before. What choice did he have? Jobs were scarce, especially for a man his age with limited English skills. His family depended on him. So he endured the humiliation, the disrespect, the casual cruelty day after day. But today was different. Mr. Torres arrived at school to find his janitorial closet completely ransacked. Cleaning supplies were dumped across the floor, mop heads had been thrown into the toilet in the nearby bathroom, and someone had written, "Go home," across his time card in permanent marker. His hands shook as he methodically began to clean up the mess, his chest tight with anxiety. He would be behind on his rounds all day now. As he worked, He heard the unmistakable sound of Blake Harrington's laugh echoing down the hallway. The dynasty had arrived early to witness the fallout of their handiwork. Mr. Torres kept his head down, pretending not to notice them watching him from around the corner. "Hey, Martinez," Blake called out, deliberately using the wrong name. Mr. Torres continued working, hoping they would lose interest if he didn't respond. "I'm talking to you, Janitor," Blake persisted, approaching with his entourage trailing behind him. "Don't they teach manners where you come from?" Mr. Torres finally looked up, his face carefully blank. "My name is Torres, Señor. Miguel Torres." "Whatever," Madison cut in, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "We noticed your closet is a mess. You really should take better care of school property." Tyler snickered. "Yeah, wouldn't want you to get fired. Immigration might come looking." Mr. Torres felt his face grow hot, but he maintained his composure. His daughter had taught him the English phrase years ago, "Don't give them the satisfaction." So he simply nodded and returned to his work, pretending not to hear as they continued their taunts. From her position by the water fountain, Lily Whitlock watched the scene unfold. Her stomach churned with guilt and shame. She should say something. She should report this. But then she remembered how last year's scholarship student had been frozen out after reporting similar behavior. How they'd ended up transferring schools mid-semester. Lily couldn't risk that. Her parents had sacrificed too much for her to be here. As the days passed, the dynasty's attacks grew increasingly bold. They seemed to be competing with each other to see who could devise the most humiliating scenario for the quiet janitor. Aiden orchestrated a hallway spill of cafeteria food that took Mr. Torres 2 hours to clean while students, accidentally, walked through it repeatedly. Madison convinced a teacher she needed bathroom breaks during which she would find Mr. Torres and ask him increasingly personal questions about his immigration status, recording his uncomfortable responses on her phone. Blake arranged for several students to leave anonymous complaints about unclean bathrooms with the administration, leading to a formal reprimand in Mr. Torres's employment file. The school's annual talent showcase became their most elaborate stage. As Mr. Torres cleaned the auditorium after rehearsals, the dynasty stayed behind, pretending to practice their act, a supposedly comedic skit. When Mr. Torres was in earshot, they began performing their actual routine, a cruel imitation of the illegal janitor, complete with exaggerated accents and miming of cleaning motions. They had even created a costume with his name badge. Mr. Torres froze, mop in hand, as he realized what they were doing. For a moment, he considered walking away as he always did. But something in him finally broke. The thought of his granddaughter Carmen, who had recently told him how proud she was of him for supporting her education, gave him a spark of courage. He walked slowly toward the stage, his heart pounding. The dynasty didn't notice him at first, too caught up in their performance and their own laughter. "Please," he said quietly when they finally saw him. "I am a person, with a family. Why do you treat me this way?" There was a moment of silence before Blake recovered. "Chill out, man. It's just a joke." "Not to me," Mr. Torres replied, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "Not to my family." Madison rolled her eyes dramatically. "God, it's not like we're actually hurting you. Don't be so sensitive. You think the administration cares what happens to the help?" Tyler added smugly, "My mom donates more to this school in a year than they pay you in a decade." As Mr. Torres stood there, trying to find words to respond, Aiden quietly raised his phone, recording the janitor's humiliation. Later, Mr. Torres would discover that this video, edited to make it appear as though he was aggressively confronting students, had been shared throughout the school's social networks with a caption, "Watch the janitor lose it when we ask him to actually do his job." That night, Mr. Torres sat at his small kitchen table, staring at his weathered hands. The calluses from decades of manual labor were like a map of his life. He had endured so much over the years, crossing borders in dangerous conditions, working 3 jobs simultaneously when he first arrived, facing discrimination and hardship, all without losing his dignity. Yet somehow, these teenagers had the power to make him feel worthless. Tomorrow, he decided, he would speak to Principal Hargrove directly. He couldn't continue like this. What Mr. Torres didn't know was that the dynasty had already been to see the principal, armed with their edited video and a story about feeling threatened by the aggressive janitor. Principal Edward Hargrove's office reflected the man himself, meticulously arranged, expensive, and designed to intimidate. Degrees from prestigious universities lined the walls alongside photographs of Hargrove with various celebrities and politicians whose children attended Westridge. The massive mahogany desk seemed to grow larger as Mr. Torres sat before it, hands folded in his lap to hide their trembling. He had waited over an hour past his scheduled appointment time, watching as several parents with designer clothes and impatient expressions were ushered in ahead of him despite arriving later. The secretary had avoided making eye contact with him, as though his presence in the administrative wing was somehow inappropriate. "Mr. Torres," Principal Hargrove finally addressed him without looking up from his computer. "I understand you wanted to speak with me about some sort of issue?" Mr. Torres cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. Thank you for seeing me. I need to talk about some students who have been—" "Ah, yes," Hargrove interrupted, finally glancing up. "I believe I know what this is about. The incident in the auditorium yesterday." "Yes," Mr. Torres said, relief washing over him that the principal already knew. "The Dynasty students, they have been—" "I've already spoken with Mr. Harrington and his friends," Hargrove interrupted again, his tone cooling significantly. "They showed me a rather concerning video of your interaction with them." Mr. Torres felt his heart sink. "The video does not show everything, sir. They were mocking me, pretending to be me, saying things about my immigration." "Mr. Torres," Hargrove cut in sharply, "these are serious allegations you're making against some of our most accomplished students. Students whose families have contributed significantly to this institution." He leaned forward, lowering his voice as though sharing a confidence. "Between us, aren't you perhaps being a bit sensitive?" "No, sir," Mr. Torres replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "For months they have been targeting me. The closet incident, the stink bomb, the posters. Teenage pranks," Hargrove dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Nothing malicious. Boys will be boys, you understand. And girls will be girls?" Mr. Torres asked quietly, thinking of Madison's cruelty. Principal Hargrove's expression hardened. "I'll pretend I didn't hear that tone, Mr. Torres. Let me be very clear. These families pay considerable sums to send their children to Westridge. The board has certain expectations about the environment we provide, which includes not having staff members confronting students in an aggressive manner." "I was not aggressive," Mr. Torres insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "Please, you can ask other students who have seen how they treat me." "What other students?" Hargrove asked dismissively. "No one else has reported anything." Mr. Torres thought of Lily and the other scholarship students who watched in silence, too afraid to speak up. He couldn't blame them. "Mr. Torres," Hargrove continued, his tone now patronizing, "I appreciate that this job can be challenging. If you find yourself unable to handle interactions with our student body appropriately, perhaps we should discuss whether Westridge is the right fit for your employment." The threat hung in the air between them. Mr. Torres felt the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders. His granddaughter's tuition, the money he sent to his mother, his rent, all dependent on this job. "I understand," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Excellent," Hargrove replied briskly, already turning back to his computer. "I'm glad we had this talk. I trust there won't be any further incidents." Mr. Torres rose slowly from his chair, dignity in defeat. As he reached for the door handle, a sharp knock from the other side startled him. He opened the door to find the school secretary looking flustered. "I'm so sorry to interrupt, Principal Hargrove, but there's someone here who insists on seeing you immediately. I told him you were in a meeting, but he—" A tall figure appeared behind her, dressed simply in jeans and a black blazer, his shoulder-length hair framing a face instantly recognizable to anyone who had seen a movie in the past 30 years. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Keanu Reeves said, his deep voice carrying into the suddenly silent office. "The front office said I might find you here." Principal Hargrove froze, mouth slightly open, as one of Hollywood's most beloved actors stood casually in his doorway. Mr. Torres, equally shocked, found himself accidentally blocking the famous visitor's entrance. "Excuse me," Mr. Torres mumbled, moving to step aside. Keanu placed a gentle hand on the janitor's shoulder, looking directly into his eyes with genuine concern. "Are you okay, sir? You seem upset." Before Mr. Torres could respond, Principal Hargrove had practically vaulted over his desk, hand extended toward Keanu. "Mr. Reeves." What an unexpected honor. Please come in. I had no idea you were visiting today. Keanu Reeves stood in the doorway, an unexpected presence that immediately transformed the atmosphere of Principal Hargrove's office. He wore no designer labels, carried no obvious signs of his celebrity status, yet his quiet charisma filled the room more effectively than any ostentatious display of wealth ever could. I was in the neighborhood, Keanu explained with a casual shrug. I'm participating in that arts education program your school signed up for. Artists connecting with students. He glanced at his watch. I'm actually a bit early. The program coordinator said someone would meet me at reception, but nobody was there. Principal Hargrove's face cycled through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, realization, and finally panic. The Celebrity Arts Mentorship Program. Of course. That was supposed to be next week. I mean, we're absolutely thrilled to have you today. A slight administrative mix-up. Mr. Torres watched this transformation with quiet amazement. The imperious principal who had dismissed his concerns moments ago was now practically tripping over himself to accommodate this visitor. Mr. Torres, Hargrove said with a forced smile, we'll continue our discussion another time. Thank you for your input. But Keanu didn't move from the doorway, his gaze shifting between the principal and the janitor. I didn't mean to interrupt anything important, he said, genuine concern in his voice. Nothing important at all, Hargrove assured him hastily. Just a routine staff matter. It didn't look routine, Keanu observed quietly. Sir, you seemed very upset, he added, addressing Mr. Torres directly. If you need more time with the principal. Mr. Torres found himself at a loss for words. No one at Westridge had ever shown such consideration for his feelings or time. It's fine, he finally managed, eyes downcast. I should get back to work. But as he tried to move past Keanu in the doorway, the actor noticed something that the principal had overlooked in his excitement. The slight tremor in Mr. Torres's hands, the redness around his eyes, the defeated slump of his shoulders. Are you sure you're okay? Keanu asked, lowering his voice and stepping slightly away from Hargrove's earshot. Something in the actor's genuine concern broke through Mr. Torres's carefully maintained composure. They are making my life impossible, he whispered. The students. And no one believes me. Keanu's expression shifted subtly, a barely perceptible hardening around the eyes, a thoughtful set to his jaw. He nodded once, seemingly coming to a decision. Principal Hargrove, he called over his shoulder, still maintaining eye contact with Mr. Torres. Before we discuss the program, I'd like to hear more about what's going on with this gentleman. It seems important. Hargrove's smile faltered. Mr. Reeves, I assure you, this is just a minor internal matter. Nothing that should concern you or take away time from your visit with our students. Actually, Keanu replied, stepping fully back into the office, I think it might be exactly what should concern me. Part of the arts program is about respect and communication, right? Sounds like there might be a real-world lesson happening right here. He guided Mr. Torres back to the chair he had just vacated and took the seat beside him, leaving Principal Hargrove momentarily speechless. Now, Keanu said gently to Mr. Torres, why don't you tell me what's been happening? Mr. Torres hesitated, glancing nervously at Hargrove, whose face had become a rigid mask. Please, Keanu encouraged. From the beginning. So Mr. Torres began to speak. Haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency as months of pent-up humiliation and frustration found release. He told Keanu about the daily insults, the escalating pranks, the mocking video, the threatening notes, all while Principal Hargrove's expression darkened. These are very serious accusations, Hargrove interjected when Mr. Torres described the closet incident. Without evidence. There are security cameras in that hallway, Mr. Torres said quietly. I asked the security guard to check, but he said he needed your permission. Which students are responsible? Keanu asked, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. Mr. Torres named the dynasty members one by one, watching as Principal Hargrove's face grew increasingly pale. These were the children of some of the school's most powerful families. Donors, board members, people with influence in Hollywood circles that even Keanu Reeves would recognize. Mr. Reeves, Hargrove attempted again. These are some of our most accomplished students. They're teenagers. Sometimes they don't think through the consequences of their actions. I'm sure whatever happened has been blown out of proportion. Keanu turned his steady gaze toward the principal. With all due respect, that sounds like you've already decided not to believe him. He paused, letting the observation hang in the air. You know, I've worked on a lot of movie sets. One thing I've learned is that how people treat the crew, especially those in service positions, tells you everything about their character. Principal Hargrove shifted uncomfortably in his chair. So, Keanu continued, what's being done to address this situation? Hargrove cleared his throat. Well, as I was explaining to Mr. Torres before you arrived, we take all allegations seriously, but without concrete evidence. The security footage? Keanu suggested. That would be hard to access at this point, Hargrove hedged. Our system only keeps recordings for a limited time. Convenient, Keanu remarked. And the video these students showed you of Mr. Torres supposedly being aggressive, is that still available? Hargrove reluctantly nodded. I'd like to see it, Keanu said firmly. And afterward, I'd like to meet these students. Principal Hargrove's professional smile finally collapsed entirely. Mr. Reeves, I'm not sure that would be appropriate. I think, Keanu said, rising to his full height, it would be exactly appropriate. In fact, I can't think of a better way to kick off the Celebrity Arts Mentorship Program than with a lesson on respect and dignity. Can you? The video played on Principal Hargrove's large monitor, casting a blue glow across the faces of its 3 viewers. It showed Mr. Torres approaching the dynasty on the auditorium stage, but began only after their mockery of him. The editing was obvious even to an untrained eye, choppy cuts, missing context, selective framing that made the janitor appear to be the aggressor. When it ended, Keanu leaned back in his chair. That's clearly edited, he stated matter-of-factly. I've spent enough time in post-production to recognize when someone's manipulated footage. Principal Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. Even so, Mr. Torres's reaction was the reaction of someone who had been pushed too far, Keanu finished firmly. I'd like to speak with these students now. 20 minutes later, the dynasty filed into the conference room adjacent to Principal Hargrove's office. Their initial excitement at being summoned for a surprise celebrity meeting quickly faded as they noticed Mr. Torres sitting quietly beside Keanu. Blake's confident swagger faltered. Madison stopped mid-text. Aiden and Tyler exchanged nervous glances. Please sit down, Keanu said, gesturing to the empty chairs across the table. They complied silently, the usual arrogance in their postures noticeably diminished by confusion. I'm Keanu Reeves, he began unnecessarily, and I'm here as part of the Celebrity Arts Mentorship Program. Principal Hargrove thought it would be valuable for us to have this conversation before I meet with the rest of the student body. He paused, letting his gaze move from one face to another. I've just watched your video. The initial confusion on their faces transformed into apprehension. Blake attempted to recover first. It's awesome to meet you, Mr. Reeves. We're huge fans of your work, he said with a practiced ease that had charmed countless teachers and parents before. The video was just a misunderstanding. We were practicing for the talent show and... I'm not interested in excuses, Keanu interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. I'd like to understand why. Why what? Madison asked, her feigned innocence as polished as her manicure. Why you've been targeting Mr. Torres. Why you find it acceptable to mock someone's accent, job, or immigration status. Why you locked him in a closet. Why you created fake immigration posters with his face. Their expressions cycled through shock, guilt, and defensive anger as they realized the extent of what had been revealed. With all due respect, Mr. Reeves, Tyler began, his tone suggesting anything but respect, you've only heard one side of the story. I've heard enough, Keanu replied evenly. And I've seen enough. The question isn't whether these things happened, it's why you thought they were okay. They were just jokes, Aiden mumbled, his eyes fixed on the table. Were they funny to Mr. Torres? Keanu asked, turning to the janitor. Mr. Torres shook his head slowly. No, senor. They were not funny to me. Humor at someone else's expense isn't humor. It's cruelty, Keanu continued. And cruelty says more about the person inflicting it than the person receiving it. Blake's face flushed with anger. Look, we didn't mean any harm. It's not a big deal. He's just what? Keanu challenged. Just the janitor? Just an immigrant? Just someone you thought couldn't fight back? The room fell silent. Principal Hargrove, who had been hovering awkwardly by the door, looked as though he wished he could disappear entirely. "Let me tell you something about just jobs," Keanu continued, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. "My first job was as a janitor at a high school not so different from this one. My grandfather was a janitor his entire life. He taught me that there's dignity in all work done well, in taking pride in creating clean, safe spaces for others." The Dynasty students squirmed under his steady gaze. "I've worked with some of the most celebrated directors and actors in the world," Keanu continued. "And I can tell you that on every successful set, every person, from the biggest star to the person sweeping the floor, is treated with respect. Because that's how you build something meaningful." He leaned forward, his expression intense but not unkind. "What are you building with your actions? What kind of people are you becoming when you use your advantages to hurt others rather than help them?" Madison's carefully composed facade cracked first. Tears welled in her eyes. "We didn't think about it that way," she whispered. "That's the problem," Keanu replied. "You didn't think about Mr. Torres as a person at all. With feelings, with a family, with a life worthy of dignity." Aiden sat up straighter. "My parents always say that networking and social connections are what matter most. That the people at the top are the ones who count. And yet," Keanu observed, "when I walk onto a new set, the first people I make friends with are the crew, the lighting technicians, the sound engineers, the caterers, the cleaners. They're the backbone of every production. They work harder than anyone, often with the least recognition." He glanced at Mr. Torres, whose eyes were downcast but who listened intently. "Mr. Torres has been working since before you were born, supporting his family, contributing to society. He deserves your respect, not because I'm saying so, but because that's the basic dignity every human being is entitled to." Blake, the normally unflappable leader of the Dynasty, finally spoke up. "So what now? Are we getting suspended? Expelled?" Principal Hargrove stepped forward quickly. "I don't think such extreme measures are necessary." "Actually," Keanu interrupted, "I have a different suggestion. But first, I'd like to hear from Mr. Torres. What do you think should happen?" All eyes turned to the janitor, who seemed startled to be asked his opinion. He considered the question carefully. "I do not want to ruin their futures," he said finally. "I just want to do my job with respect. I want them to understand that what they do affects others." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "I think there's a way to accomplish that." He turned to Principal Hargrove. "With your permission, I'd like to make a proposal to the school administration and these students." Principal Hargrove, clearly relieved that expulsion was off the table but wary of what might come next, nodded cautiously. "We're certainly open to suggestions, Mr. Reeves." "Good," Keanu replied, his expression resolute. "Because I believe what's needed here isn't punishment, but education. And I have some ideas about how that might work." He turned back to the Dynasty, whose expressions ranged from relief to apprehension. "But make no mistake, what happens next will depend entirely on your willingness to take responsibility for your actions and commit to making amends." For perhaps the first time in their privileged lives, the Dynasty remained completely silent, waiting for someone else to determine their fate. Word spread through Westridge Academy like wildfire. By lunch period, every student knew that Keanu Reeves was in the building. Text messages and social media posts multiplied exponentially, each adding new layers of speculation. Some claimed he was scouting for his next film. Others insisted he was considering sending his non-existent children to the school. The most popular theory involved a donation for a new campus building to be named after him. None of these rumors came close to the truth. When the unexpected assembly was announced over the loudspeaker at 2 p.m., students flooded into the auditorium with unprecedented enthusiasm. Even the normally apathetic seniors rushed for front-row seats. Teachers struggled to maintain order as excitement rippled through the crowd. Lily Whitlock slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back. She had been avoiding the Dynasty all day, uncomfortable with the guilt that had been building inside her since witnessing their latest cruelty toward Mr. Torres. The rumors about Keanu Reeves provided a welcome distraction from her thoughts. Principal Hargrove approached the podium, his practiced smile strained at the edges. "Students of Westridge Academy," he began, his voice carrying over the excited murmurs. "We have a very special guest with us today as part of our Celebrity Arts Mentorship program. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Keanu Reeves." The auditorium erupted in applause and cheers as Keanu walked onto the stage. He wore the same simple outfit from earlier, no costume or pretense, just a genuine presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He raised a hand in greeting, waiting patiently for the noise to subside. "Thank you for that welcome," he began, his voice resonating through the space. "I'm here to talk with you about something important, something that goes beyond acting techniques or film careers." The students leaned forward expectantly, their faces bright with anticipation. This was not the celebrity speech they had imagined. "I want to talk about dignity," Keanu continued. "About respect. About how we treat each other, especially those we might see as different from ourselves or whose contributions we might take for granted." A confused murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't the exciting Hollywood insider talk they had expected. "Before I continue," Keanu said, gesturing toward the side of the stage, "I'd like to ask someone to join me. Mr. Torres, would you please come up here?" A collective gasp echoed through the auditorium as the school janitor hesitantly walked onto the stage. Mr. Torres looked overwhelmed, his eyes downcast, his hands clasped tightly before him. Some students snickered. Others looked confused. Most simply stared in bewilderment. "This is Mr. Miguel Torres," Keanu introduced him, placing a supportive hand on the janitor's shoulder. "Many of you see him every day, but I wonder how many of you actually see him, the person, not just the uniform." The auditorium had gone completely silent now. "Mr. Torres came to this country from El Salvador 25 years ago," Keanu continued. "He's worked multiple jobs to bring his family to safety. His granddaughter is studying to become a doctor. For 8 years, he has kept this school clean, safe, and functioning smoothly. Without him and others like him, none of what happens here would be possible." Mr. Torres stood straighter now, surprised by the recognition of his contributions. "It's come to my attention," Keanu said, his tone becoming more serious, "that some students at this school have been treating Mr. Torres with deliberate cruelty." Another ripple of whispers. Eyes darted toward the front row where the dynasty sat, uncharacteristically subdued. "I'm not here to name names or assign blame," Keanu clarified. "I'm here to ask all of you a question. What kind of community do you want to build? What kind of people do you want to become?" His words hung in the air, heavier than any special effect from his action films. "In my career, I've been fortunate to work with extraordinary people from all walks of life. The best sets, the most successful projects, are those where everyone, regardless of title or position, is treated with respect. Where the person cleaning up at the end of the day gets the same consideration as the person whose name appears on the poster." He paused, scanning the sea of young faces. "The way you treat people when there's nothing they can do for you, that's who you really are. The way you speak to someone who serves you, cleans up after you, works in a position you might consider beneath you, that reveals your true character more than any achievement or talent ever could." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded slowly, thoughtfully. "I began my working life as a janitor," Keanu revealed, eliciting surprised looks. "My grandfather was a janitor his entire life. He taught me that there's dignity in all work done with care and purpose. That a person's worth isn't measured by their title or salary, but by their character and how they treat others." He turned to Mr. Torres again, giving him a small nod of encouragement. "When I heard about how Mr. Torres has been treated, I was reminded of something my grandfather told me. The measure of society isn't how it treats its highest achievers, but how it treats those with the least power. By that measure, what would we say about Westridge Academy?" The silence that followed was profound. Many students looked down at their hands, unable to meet Keanu's steady gaze. "The good news," he continued after a moment, "is that communities can change. People can grow. Which is why, with Principal Hargrove's approval, I'm announcing a new initiative at Westridge." He gestured toward the principal, who stepped forward with a stiff nod that suggested both reluctance and resignation. "Starting next week, we'll be implementing the Dignity in Service program. Every student will spend time working alongside the maintenance and service staff of this school, learning firsthand what their jobs entail and the challenges they face." Shocked murmurs spread through the audience. A few groans could be heard. But surprisingly, many faces showed interest, even curiosity. Additionally, Keanu continued, we'll be establishing a scholarship fund in Mr. Torres's name to support students who, like his granddaughter, are working to build better futures through education. Mr. Torres's eyes widened in surprise at this announcement. I'll be making the initial contribution, Keanu added, but I hope the Westridge community will join me in supporting this initiative. He stepped back from the microphone, surveying the auditorium one last time before concluding. We all have choices about how we treat others. Every interaction is an opportunity to build someone up or tear them down. I hope all of you will join me in choosing respect, empathy, and dignity, not just during this program, but throughout your lives. As he finished speaking, something unexpected happened. In the back row, Lily Whitlock stood up and began to applaud. Slowly, others joined her. First a handful, then dozens, until nearly the entire auditorium was on its feet. Mr. Torres stood on the stage, tears shining in his eyes, as the students of Westridge Academy gave him something he had never received from them before: recognition of his humanity. After the assembly, students filtered out of the auditorium in unusual silence, many deep in thought. The dynasty remained in their seats, as instructed by Principal Hargrove, waiting for their private meeting with Keanu and Mr. Torres. Backstage, Mr. Torres was still processing what had happened. The scholarship fund, he said quietly to Keanu. I don't know what to say. My granddaughter Carmen will be its first recipient if you'd like, Keanu replied with a warm smile. But that's not all I wanted to discuss with you. He gestured toward the empty auditorium where the dynasty still sat in the front row. Are you ready to speak with them again? Mr. Torres nodded, straightening his uniform shirt. Yes, I am ready. They walked back onto the stage together, accompanied by Principal Hargrove, whose demeanor had shifted dramatically since the morning. Where he had once been dismissive of Mr. Torres, he now treated him with careful deference, the abrupt change speaking volumes about his character. Blake, Madison, Tyler, and Aiden looked up at them with mixed expressions of defiance and apprehension. Thank you for waiting, Keanu began, sitting on the edge of the stage to be closer to their level. I wanted to continue our conversation from earlier, but first, I'd like to share something personal with you. He paused, his expression becoming more contemplative. When I was about your age, maybe a little younger, my life wasn't very stable. We moved around a lot. Money was tight. For a while, I lived with my grandparents. The dynasty students listened with reluctant fascination. This wasn't the Hollywood glamour story they had expected. My grandfather was a janitor at an elementary school for over 30 years, Keanu continued. He emigrated from Hawaii to the mainland with very little education, but with an incredible work ethic and sense of responsibility. Every morning, he'd wake up at 4 a.m. to get to the school before anyone else, making sure everything was perfect before the children arrived. Mr. Torres nodded in recognition of this familiar routine. I used to help him sometimes, especially during summer break, Keanu recalled, a distant look in his eyes. One morning, I was complaining about having to mop the cafeteria floor, typical teenage attitude. He stopped what he was doing and said something I've never forgotten. Keanu's voice took on a deeper, slightly accented quality as he quoted his grandfather. This job isn't just about cleaning floors. It's about creating a safe space where children can learn. Every spot I clean might be where a kid sits to read their first book or solve their first math problem. I'm part of their education too, even if they never know my name. He looked directly at the dynasty now. That perspective changed how I saw his work, and all work. There's no such thing as just a janitor, or just any job. There are only people contributing in different ways to the same community. Madison wiped away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts to maintain composure. Blake stared at his expensive sneakers. My grandfather taught me more about dignity, respect, and integrity through his work as a janitor than many of my wealthiest, most famous colleagues have in all the years since, Keanu continued. When I think about the kind of person I want to be, I think about him. Not because he was famous or powerful, but because he was kind and dignified even when people didn't treat him that way. Mr. Torres had been listening intently, his expression showing surprise and growing emotion. Your grandfather, he said softly. He sounds like a good man. The best I've known, Keanu agreed. Which is why, when I heard about how you've been treated here, it felt personal to me. Like watching someone disrespect his memory. The weight of these words settled heavily on the dynasty. For perhaps the first time, They were confronted with the reality that their actions had consequences beyond their immediate social circle, that they had unwittingly insulted someone their celebrity idol deeply respected. "I never knew my grandfather," Aiden admitted suddenly. "Both my parents were raised by nannies mostly. My dad's always working on film sets. My mom has her assistant buy my birthday presents," Madison added quietly. "She's usually too busy with foundation events to come herself." Tyler looked up, vulnerability breaking through his usual arrogance. "My mother is running for office. She has image consultants who tell our whole family how to dress, how to speak, who to be friends with. Everything's about appearances." Blake remained silent, but his usual confident posture had collapsed. Keanu listened without judgment, recognizing the thread connecting these revelations. Children raised with material abundance but emotional scarcity, taught to value status over character. "It sounds like you've had your own struggles," he acknowledged. "That doesn't excuse how you've behaved toward Mr. Torres, but it helps explain it. Sometimes when we feel unseen or unvalued ourselves, we look for someone else to feel superior to." The four teenagers exchanged glances, this insight striking uncomfortably close to home. "I've met many wealthy, powerful people in my career," Keanu continued. "The truly impressive ones don't need to remind others of their status. They're the ones who learn the names of every crew member, who thank the caterers, who treat the production assistants with the same respect they show the studio executives." He stood up, moving closer to the dynasty. "Success isn't measured by how many people are beneath you, but by how many people you lift up alongside you." Principal Hargrove, who had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. "These are valuable insights, Mr. Reeves. Perhaps we should discuss the practical aspects of the Dignity in Service program you proposed." "Yes," Keanu agreed, turning to Mr. Torres. "Mr. Torres, would you be willing to mentor these students as they learn about your work? To share your expertise and experience with them?" Mr. Torres considered the request carefully, studying the four teenagers who had caused him so much pain. "Yes," he said finally. "I will teach them, if they are willing to learn." "Are you?" Keanu asked the dynasty directly. "Are you willing to set aside your assumptions and preconceptions? To learn not just about janitorial work, but about dignity, respect, and community?" One by one, they nodded, Blake last of all, his acknowledgement coming with obvious reluctance. "Good," Keanu said. "Because character isn't built through easy choices. It's forged through challenges that push us beyond our comfort zones, that make us question our assumptions about ourselves and others." He turned to Principal Hargrove. "I'd like these four students to work directly with Mr. Torres for the next month, not as punishment, but as education. 3 hours after school, twice a week. I'll be checking in personally on their progress." Principal Hargrove looked as though he wanted to object but couldn't find the words, not with Keanu Reeves fixing him with that steady gaze. "Additionally," Keanu continued, "I'd like Mr. Torres to have a permanent position on the school's Dignity and Respect Committee, with the authority to report incidents of bullying or disrespect directly to the board." This suggestion clearly alarmed Hargrove, but again, he found himself nodding in agreement. Mr. Torres stood straighter, the possibility of real change beginning to take root in his mind. For the first time since he'd started working at Westridge, he felt visible, not as a target or a function, but as a person worthy of respect. "One last thing," Keanu said, addressing both Principal Hargrove and the dynasty. "Real change requires real commitment. I'll be returning at the end of the month to see how this program is progressing. I expect to find substantial improvement, not just in policies, but in attitudes." The message was clear. This wasn't a one-day celebrity visit that could be forgotten once he left. This was the beginning of a transformation that would require genuine effort from everyone involved. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Torres found himself walking alongside Keanu toward the exit. "Why did you do this?" he asked quietly. "You could have just signed autographs and left." Keanu paused, considering the question carefully. "Because my grandfather would have expected nothing less," he answered simply. "And because change only happens when someone cares enough to start it." The dynasty's first day of working with Mr. Torres began awkwardly. They arrived at the maintenance room after school, dressed inappropriately in designer clothes and expensive sneakers. Madison had even worn heels. Mr. Torres wordlessly handed them each a set of coveralls and pointed to the small bathroom where they could change. "This is ridiculous," Blake muttered, examining the rough fabric. "My attorney dad says this probably violates child labor laws." "Your attorney dad approved this program in writing," Principal Hargrove reminded him tensely. The principal had made a brief appearance to ensure the program was starting as agreed, though his discomfort was obvious. "As did all of your parents." The calls to the dynasty's families had been surprisingly effective. Perhaps it was the mention of Keanu Reeves's personal involvement, or perhaps it was the carefully worded explanation of the alternative consequences. Whatever the reason, permission forms had been signed and returned within 24 hours. "Mr. Hargrove," Mr. Torres said politely but firmly, "we will be fine now." "Thank you." The dismissal was gentle but clear. The principal nodded stiffly and retreated, leaving the dynasty alone with a man they had tormented for months. An uncomfortable silence filled the small maintenance room. "So," Aiden finally spoke, "what do we do first?" Mr. Torres considered the question. "First," he said, "we prepare. Every job needs proper preparation." He began methodically arranging cleaning supplies on a cart: disinfectant, glass cleaner, microfiber cloths, garbage bags. "Can't we just use those automatic floor cleaning machines?" Tyler asked. "They've got robots for this stuff now, right?" "The school has one machine," Mr. Torres explained patiently, "for the gymnasium floor only. Everything else, we clean by hand." "We?" Madison asked. "There are other janitors?" "Two others," Mr. Torres confirmed. "Mrs. Patel works mornings. Mr. Washington works weekends. I am responsible for afternoons and evenings." He paused, then added, 3 people to clean a campus of 15 buildings. The dynasty exchanged glances as this reality sank in. "Today," Mr. Torres continued, "we cleaned the science wing bathrooms." Their expressions of horror would have been comical under different circumstances. "The bathrooms," Blake repeated incredulously. "That's part of my job," Mr. Torres finished for him. "Every day." He wheeled the cart out of the storage room, gesturing for them to follow. As they walked across campus, students stared and whispered. The mighty dynasty in janitorial coveralls was not something anyone had expected to see. "Everyone's looking at us," Madison whispered, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Yes," Mr. Torres said simply. "Now you know how it feels." When they reached the science wing bathrooms, Mr. Torres stopped outside the doors. "Before we start, I want to show you something." He pulled a small, worn photograph from his pocket, a young woman in graduation attire, beaming at the camera. "This is my granddaughter, Carmen. She is studying to be a doctor. Every bathroom I clean, every floor I mop, every window I wash pays for her books, her apartment, her future." He tucked the photo carefully back into his pocket. "When the work seems beneath you, remember, no honest work is beneath anyone. Only dishonest actions make us less than we should be." With that, he pushed open the door to the boys' bathroom and began explaining proper cleaning techniques, the importance of disinfection, the correct order of operations. For the first hour, the dynasty worked in resentful silence, holding their breath dramatically, making faces behind Mr. Torres's back. But gradually, as they struggled with tasks that he completed effortlessly, their attitude shifted from contempt to reluctant respect. "How do you get the mirrors so streak-free?" Madison asked after her third attempt left cloudy marks across the glass. "Like this," Mr. Torres demonstrated, showing her how to fold the cloth properly and apply the cleaner efficiently. "It takes practice." By the end of the 3 hours, they were exhausted in ways they had never experienced. Not the familiar tiredness from sports practice or staying up late at parties, but the bone-deep fatigue of physical labor. Their hands were red from cleaning solution, their backs ached from bending and scrubbing, and their confidence had been humbled by the realization that what they had dismissed as unskilled labor actually required considerable technique and stamina. "Same time Thursday," Mr. Torres reminded them as they prepared to leave. "We will clean the cafeteria after lunch rush." They groaned collectively but offered no argument. As the weeks progressed, something unexpected began to happen. The dynasty started arriving on time, sometimes even early. They began asking questions about Mr. Torres's life, tentatively at first, then with genuine curiosity. They learned about his journey from El Salvador, the 3 jobs he had worked simultaneously to bring his wife and children to America, the night classes he had taken to improve his English. They heard about his daughter's struggle to find affordable childcare for Carmen while she worked double shifts as a nurse, and how Mr. Torres had often watched his granddaughter overnight so his daughter could sleep before her next shift. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Aiden asked one afternoon as they cleaned the library. "When we were, you know." Mr. Torres considered the question carefully. "Would you have listened?" he asked simply. The silence that followed was answer enough. "My father wants me to go into real estate," Blake admitted during their 6th session. "Take over the family business. I've never even considered doing anything else." "What would you choose if you could do anything?" Mr. Torres asked. Blake looked surprised at the question. "I don't know," he said finally. "No one's ever asked me that before." As Principal Hargrove watched the dynasty working alongside Mr. Torres, his initial skepticism gradually gave way to grudging admiration. The program was having effects he hadn't anticipated. Other students had begun greeting Mr. Torres in the hallways. Several had even volunteered to join the Dignity in Service program, despite it not being required of them. Most surprising of all was the change in the dynasty themselves. The arrogance that had defined them was softening into something more thoughtful. They still traveled as a group, still commanded attention when they entered a room, but there was a new awareness in their interactions with others, a consideration that hadn't existed before. "I never thought I'd say this," Principal Hargrove admitted to Mr. Torres after 3 weeks, "but this program seems to be working." Mr. Torres nodded but offered no confirmation or praise. He had learned to be cautious with Hargrove's sudden changes of heart. The true test came during the 4th week, when college admission letters began arriving. Madison received her acceptance to Stanford, her dream school, and brought the letter to show Mr. Torres before sharing it with anyone else. "My personal essay," she explained, "was about what I've learned working with you. About seeing people instead of positions. About recognizing privilege." Mr. Torres smiled, genuinely pleased for her. "You have learned well," he said softly. "Now you must take these lessons with you, beyond Westridge." The following day, Blake approached Mr. Torres alone, his usual confidence absent. "I've been thinking," he said hesitantly, "about what you asked, what I would choose if I could do anything. I think I might want to teach. Maybe work with kids who don't have all the advantages I've had." Mr. Torres nodded, careful not to overreact to this revelation. "Teaching is a noble profession," he said simply. "You would be good at it, I think." As the month drew to a close, the dynasty found themselves facing a reality they hadn't expected. They were actually dreading the end of the program. What had begun as a humiliating punishment had somehow transformed into a valuable experience, one that had changed how they saw not just Mr. Torres, but themselves. "He's coming back tomorrow, right?" Tyler asked as they finished their final scheduled session. "Keanu." Mr. Torres nodded. "Yes. To see what we have accomplished." The 4 teenagers exchanged meaningful glances. "We've been talking," Aiden said carefully. "We want to continue working with you. Not because we have to, but because we want to." Mr. Torres studied them thoughtfully, searching for any hint of insincerity. Finding none, he nodded once. "Then we will continue," he agreed. "Not as punishment, but as partnership." The next day, as Keanu Reeves prepared to return to Westridge Academy, none of them could have predicted just how far-reaching the effects of that partnership would become. Keanu Reeves arrived at Westridge Academy exactly 1 month after his first visit, this time without fanfare or surprise. He had called ahead, arranging to meet with Mr. Torres, Principal Hargrove, and the Dynasty students in the maintenance room rather than the administrative offices. A deliberate choice that wasn't lost on any of them. The room had undergone a transformation. What had once been a cramped utilitarian space now featured a small table with chairs, a bulletin board displaying cleaning schedules and safety information, and, most significantly, framed photographs of the maintenance staff alongside other school employees. "Welcome back, Mr. Reeves." Principal Hargrove greeted him with considerably more genuine warmth than during their first meeting. "We've been looking forward to your visit." Keanu nodded in acknowledgement but directed his attention primarily to Mr. Torres. "How have things been going?" he asked directly. Before Mr. Torres could answer, the door opened and the Dynasty filed in, still wearing their coveralls, having come directly from helping clean the auditorium after a school assembly. The change in them was immediately apparent. The entitled swagger had been replaced by a quiet confidence. They greeted Keanu respectfully but without the starstruck awe of their first meeting. Most telling of all was how they positioned themselves, standing alongside Mr. Torres rather than opposite him. "Mr. Reeves," Blake began, stepping forward slightly, "we have something we'd like to show you." With Mr. Torres's permission, he opened a laptop on the small table and played a video that had been created by the Dynasty. It documented their journey over the past month, starting with awkward, resentful cleaning sessions and progressing to more collaborative work. It showed them interviewing not just Mr. Torres but all the maintenance staff about their lives, their journeys, their families. Most surprisingly, it included candid reflections from the Dynasty themselves. "I never thought about who cleaned up after me," Madison admitted on screen. "I just expected spaces to be clean without considering who made them that way or what their lives were like." "We treated Mr. Torres like he was invisible," Aiden added. "Or worse, like he was less than us because of his job. I'm ashamed of that now." The video concluded with an announcement. The Dynasty had created a new student organization called Dignity in Service, dedicated to promoting respect for all members of the school community and raising awareness about social inequality. When the video ended, the room was silent for a moment. "We want to make this a permanent part of Westridge," Tyler explained. "Not just working with the maintenance staff, but really seeing and valuing everyone who makes this school function. We're organizing a scholarship fundraiser for the Torres Education Fund too," Madison added. "My parents have agreed to match donations." Keanu listened thoughtfully, his expression giving little away. "This is impressive," he acknowledged. "But I'm more interested in hearing from Mr. Torres. Has there been real change in how you're treated day to day?" Mr. Torres considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said finally. "Not just from these four, but from others too. Students say hello in the hallways now. Teachers thank me when I clean their rooms. Principal Hargrove," he glanced at the administrator with a small smile, "has approved budget for new equipment and additional staff." Hargrove nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "We've implemented several policy changes based on Mr. Torres's recommendations. Our board recently approved a living wage initiative for all support staff as well. And the video you just saw," Mr. Torres continued, "will be shown to all incoming students as part of their orientation. Not because anyone forced this change, but because the students themselves requested it." Keanu smiled then, the warmth reaching his eyes. "That's the kind of change that lasts, the kind that comes from within rather than being imposed from outside." As their meeting concluded, they walked together across the campus. The atmosphere at Westridge had noticeably shifted. Students greeted Mr. Torres by name as they passed. A small group was hanging posters advertising the upcoming Dignity in Service fundraiser. Lily Whitlock, who had finally found her courage, was leading a committee meeting about inclusion and respect visible through an open classroom door. "You know," Keanu said thoughtfully as they walked, "most of my films involve dramatic moments of justice. The bad guys get what they deserve in some satisfying way. But real change doesn't usually happen like that." "No," Mr. Torres agreed. "Real change is slower, quieter, but more powerful in the end," Keanu added. "What's happened here isn't just about 4 students learning a lesson. It's about changing the culture of an entire institution." As they approached the main entrance, they passed a new installation that hadn't been there during Keanu's first visit. A wall displaying photographs and biographies of all school staff, from administrators to maintenance workers, with the words, "The Westridge Community," emblazoned above. Mr. Torres's photograph held a prominent position, along with a brief biography mentioning his journey from El Salvador, his family, and his granddaughter's medical studies. Beside it hung a framed picture of Carmen in her white coat from a recent clinical rotation. "The Torres Education Fund has already raised enough to cover her remaining tuition," Mr. Torres said proudly, gesturing to the photograph. "She was able to reduce her work hours and focus more on her studies." "That's wonderful," Keanu replied sincerely. "But from what you've told me about her, I suspect she inherited your work ethic regardless." Mr. Torres smiled. "Perhaps. But now she will not have to work quite so hard just to survive. She can work hard to thrive instead." As they reached the parking lot, the Dynasty approached once more. "Mr. Reeves," Blake said, extending his hand. "Thank you. Not just for what you did for Mr. Torres, but for what you did for us too." Keanu shook his hand firmly. I just created an opportunity. You four did the actual work. We'd like to keep doing it, Madison said. We've been talking with the administration about making Dignity in Service a permanent program, something that could potentially expand to other schools too. With your permission, Aiden added, turning to Mr. Torres, we'd like to name you as the program's founding advisor. Mr. Torres looked momentarily overwhelmed. I would be honored, he said finally. As the dynasty left to return to their cleaning duties, Keanu turned to Mr. Torres one last time. My grandfather would have liked you, he said simply. He believed that true dignity wasn't something others could give or take away. It came from within. But he also believed that everyone deserved to have that dignity recognized and respected. Your grandfather was a wise man, Mr. Torres replied. I wish I could have met him. In a way, you remind me of him, Keanu said thoughtfully. Not just because of your job, but because of how you've handled this situation. With patience and grace, without bitterness or revenge. You've taught these students something more valuable than any classroom lesson. As they said their goodbyes, Principal Hargrove approached with an envelope. The board asked me to give you this, Mr. Reeves, an honorarium for your participation in our Celebrity Arts Mentorship Program. Keanu glanced at the envelope, then at Mr. Torres. I appreciate the gesture, he said, but I think this would be better used as an additional contribution to the Torres Education Fund. He handed the envelope directly to Mr. Torres, who accepted it with quiet gratitude. As Keanu prepared to leave, Mr. Torres asked one final question. Will you come back sometime? Perhaps when Carmen graduates from medical school. Keanu smiled, a genuine warmth lighting his face. I wouldn't miss it, he promised. Driving away from Westridge Academy, Keanu reflected on the changes he had witnessed. What had begun as a chance encounter with a bullied janitor had catalyzed a transformation that would affect countless lives for years to come. It wasn't the kind of dramatic justice that made for blockbuster movies, but it was something perhaps more meaningful, a quiet revolution of dignity and respect. Back at the school, Mr. Torres resumed his afternoon rounds, pushing his cart through hallways that had once been sites of humiliation but now felt different. Students greeted him by name. Teachers stepped aside respectfully to let him pass. The dynasty, still in their coveralls, worked diligently in the cafeteria, teaching a group of younger students about proper waste disposal and recycling. As he moved through his familiar routine, Mr. Torres realized something had fundamentally shifted, not just in how others treated him, but in how he carried himself. The stooped shoulders had straightened. The downcast eyes now met others with quiet confidence. The hesitant voice had found its strength. 6 months later, a small ceremony was held in the Westridge Academy auditorium. The Board of Trustees, administrators, faculty, staff, and student representatives gathered for what had been described simply as a special announcement. Principal Hargrove, now a vocal advocate for the Dignity in Service program, approached the podium with genuine enthusiasm. Today marks an important milestone in Westridge history, he began. Thanks to the extraordinary success of our pilot program and the generous support of both our community and several neighboring schools, the Dignity in Service initiative will be expanding to 15 schools across the district next semester. Applause filled the auditorium, led by the dynasty. No longer just 4 entitled teenagers, but the core leadership of a movement that had begun to attract national attention. Several education journals had published articles about the program. A documentary crew was currently following their progress. I'd like to invite our program director to the stage, Hargrove continued, to make a special announcement. Mr. Torres walked confidently to the podium, no longer in his janitorial uniform but dressed in a suit that the dynasty had insisted on buying him for official program functions. His new title, Director of Inclusive Community Initiatives, came with an office, a significant salary increase, and a platform to create meaningful change. Thank you, Principal Hargrove, he began, his accented English clear and strong. Today I am proud to announce that the Torres Education Fund has surpassed its initial goal. We have raised enough to establish permanent scholarships for 10 students each year. Students who, like my granddaughter, are working to build better futures through education despite financial obstacles. More applause, especially from the maintenance and cafeteria staff seated together in a section that would have been unthinkable before. Staff members attending a school function as honored participants rather than invisible support. But today, I am even more proud to introduce our first scholarship recipient, who has recently been accepted to medical residency at UCLA. Mr. Torres's voice filled with emotion. My granddaughter, Dr. Carmen Torres. Carmen walked onto the stage in her white coat, embracing her grandfather as the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. The dynasty cheered loudest of all, their transformation from bullies to allies now complete. Among the audience members was a familiar figure who had slipped in quietly through a side door, Keanu Reeves, keeping his promise to stay connected with the program he had helped inspire. He applauded alongside everyone else, content to remain in the background as Mr. Torres enjoyed his well-deserved moment in the spotlight. Later, as the ceremony concluded and people mingled at a small reception, Keanu approached Mr. Torres and Carmen. "Congratulations, Doctor," he said warmly, shaking Carmen's hand. "Your grandfather has told me so much about your journey. And he's told me about yours," Carmen replied. "Both of you. How you change things here, not just for him, but for everyone." Keanu shook his head modestly. "Your grandfather did the real work. I just opened a door." "Sometimes," Mr. Torres said thoughtfully, "that is all people need, someone to open a door they thought was locked to them forever." As they talked, the dynasty approached cautiously, still somewhat starstruck by Keanu despite their months of maturation. "We have news," Madison announced proudly. "The State Education Department wants to implement dignity in service as part of their standard curriculum. They're creating training materials based on our experiences here. And we've been invited to speak at the National Education Conference next month," Aiden added. "Mr. Torres is giving the keynote address." Keanu smiled, looking around at what this unlikely group had created together. A janitor who had found his voice, privileged teenagers who had found their compassion, and a school that had found its conscience. "My grandfather used to say that true change doesn't happen until the powerful learn to see through the eyes of those who aren't," Keanu reflected. "Looks like that's exactly what's happened here." As evening fell and the reception wound down, Mr. Torres took a moment to stand alone in the empty hallway where, not so long ago, he had knelt to clean up a deliberately spilled drink while students mocked him. Now that same hallway bore a plaque dedicating the Dignity in Service program to all those whose work makes learning possible. The journey from invisibility to recognition had been painful at times, but standing there in the quiet hallway, Miguel Torres felt something his younger self could never have imagined during those difficult early years in America. A sense of having truly arrived, not just in a new country, but in a community where his humanity was finally, fully acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement lay the most powerful lesson of all. That dignity, once recognized, has the power to transform not just individuals, but entire communities. One person at a time. One day at a time. Until what once seemed impossible becomes the new normal, and what was once extraordinary becomes simply the way things are done. In the parking lot, as Keanu prepared to leave, he paused to watch Mr. Torres walking with his granddaughter, their animated conversation punctuated by laughter. The former janitor had come a long way from the defeated man Keanu had first encountered in Principal Hargrove's office. Some movie roles had made Keanu famous, others had made him wealthy, but few had given him the deep satisfaction of witnessing this real-life transformation. A reminder that sometimes the most meaningful changes happen not on grand stages with special effects, but in ordinary hallways where ordinary people find the courage to stand up for dignity, respect, and the simple recognition of our shared humanity.